Hi everyone, welcome to today's live lesson. It's my first on YouTube, so not using the OCAD platform. So hopefully everything goes well, hopefully the resolution's okay. It's just going to be a simple kind of half-an-hour exercise today where I'm going to be showing how you can use just objects that you find as the basis for a color matching exercise. So I'm going to be working in oil paints using a 9-color palette. Which is probably quite broad for these leaves. You could do it with a simpler palette, but I thought it would be interesting to see what we could possibly do with a pretty broad range. I've basically just collected a bunch of leaves and one flower, and they're going to be the objects that I'm going to be using as reference for the color matching. I've just kind of loosely sketched out the rough shape of the leaf as well, just to give some kind of idea of what sort of shape it is while we're working. So to begin with, I'm going to go through the paints or the pigments that we're going to be using. First off, we're going to be using titanium white, and we're going to be using ivory black. And then I've got 3 yellows, going from sort of darker and lower chroma to lighter and higher chroma, and that's raw umber, French yellow ochre, and cadmium yellow, middle. 3 reds, going from darker to lighter and lower chroma to higher chroma again, so burnt umber, burnt sienna, and cadmium red. And finally, I've got 1 blue, which is ultramarine blue, which I don't know, use it a little bit to match the greens, but obviously nothing's kind of locally, none of the local colors are blue here. I've also got a little bit of mineral spirits in a little jar there, just in case I need it to thin out the paint. And I'll probably just stick with 1, maybe 2 paintbrushes and just kind of wipe between different matching. So to begin with, I'm just going to put a little bit of each color out along here. So this is going to be my palette for today. I'll put it in my kind of roughly normal order that I'd put my paint. So I start with white and end with black. And then I usually put my blue next to my black. Ivory black's a blue black. So they kind of go together. Then cadmium yellow. Bit of as I think that's quite close to most of the colors in the leaves. And a bit of raw, which is all the colors. Now to my reds, and I go back, which is also cadmium red middle, by the way. And sienna. And finally burnt umber. Now, I've got my palette strung out, and I have my colors that I'm copying. Initially, I can to begin with, you want to just kind of think of what would actually be necessary to match these colors. You've got 2 moderately strong greens, and then 2 kind of fairly weak browns. This is sort of a more red brown and slightly darker than this, is closer to gray, the smaller leaf. And then finally, you've got a fairly high chroma relative to the others, high chroma yellow. And that yellow isn't too far off cadmium yellow in its pure form, probably slightly darker maybe. And we have to fiddle around a bit with kind of getting an approximate color for this one. It may even be pure cadmium yellow once we actually place it on the canvas. So as I say, this one almost feels the same as burnt sienna, bearing in mind that when you put your paints on your palette, the palette will affect how the paints look compared with how the paint will look on white, or how the paint would look over the top of another color. So everything with color is quite relative, and it's always worth bearing that in mind. So for instance, because this is quite a reddish brown palette, my red browns are going to look kind of maybe more gray, or they won't stand out quite as much as the blue against the brown or the yellow against the brown. Whereas if the palette was very blue, these reds would look more intense. So it's all relative. But we'll get started, and I'm going to begin with this, probably this darker green. So in order to match the chroma, which is fairly strong in this green, in the screen it might look quite black, but in real life it's sort of I would describe it as a kind of mid-yellow green that's pretty dark and fairly high chroma. So the idea is that to get to each of these colors, we want to use as few steps as possible. So you don't want to mix every single color into your leaf, because then when you try to match that color again in a painting, you'll find that how many 7 different colors in what proportions you mix them. Whereas if I can mix that green with, say, the right proportions of blue and yellow, and it matches it exactly, then I know in the future I just need to match blue and yellow, and that's it. So I'm going to begin by taking a little bit of blue. It's quite a dark color, so I'm going to mix it down this portion of the palette. I usually try to generally keep my darker mixtures down the bottom of the palette, or bottom of the string of colors, and the lighter ones at the top. Obviously things tend to get mixed up when you're in the kind of frenzy of working, but it's a good sort of general rule to follow. Then I'm going to take a touch of CAD yellow and start mixing that in. And pretty quickly, those two mixtures do get pretty close to the leaf. So I'm going to pop it on the surface of the canvas and see how it looks. Might mix a little bit more up, so I know it was just these two colors that I was using. Got a little bit too yellow there. So now I've actually placed it next to that leaf, I feel like what I've done is maybe a bit too bluish. So I'll mix a little bit more CAD yellow back into it. That's getting pretty close. So now that it's on there, I kind of feel like what I've mixed is maybe slightly too high chroma and not quite brown enough. So at this point, you're able to sort of compare, because they're right next to each other, just sort of flick your eyes backwards and forwards between the original leaf that you're copying and the color sort of swatch that you're creating. And if you need to correct anything, this is the point to do so. So I'm reluctant to use a low chroma brown like burnt umber or raw umber, because I feel like if I mix that in, it'll sort of drag the chroma down very quickly. So chroma is how intense the color is, in case you don't know that. We're looking at trying to create a color that matches the hue, which is what color is it? Is it red green, or is it, say, a red yellow, or is it a blue yellow? Is it a red brown? Is it a yellow brown? That's hue. Then we've got value. So value is how light or dark it is on a kind of scale from black to white. And then chroma is how intense is it as a version of that particular hue. So when I was talking about low chroma before, this leaf feels grayer. It moves more towards gray than this one, which is more of an intense version of almost a similar hue, these two leaves. So that's what we're kind of trying to pay attention to as we work. So this one, I'm going to maybe try and make it more brown simply by adding a little bit of burnt sienna to the mixture and seeing what happens. I'm going to test it first on the palette rather than on the painting itself. And that seems to do a pretty good job of maintaining the chroma, so it stays intense, but it does sort of brown the color slightly, which is what we want. That green that I made originally was slightly a bit too sort of vivid yellow, perhaps slightly too blue maybe. So by mixing a little bit of this blue in, what it does is it neutralizes the green slightly, but also makes it a bit more brown. So it's getting pretty close. I would say I could possibly add a touch more of the burnt sienna in. Possibly a little bit more yellow as well. Now that it's so close, it's kind of just a case of adding small portions to it just to sort of adjust it slightly. So what I'm going to do is just pop my camera off the tripod and give you a slightly better view of that color. So on the screen, possibly looks slightly too yellow. It can be a little bit tricky just because you get reflections on the wet paint. But you get the sort of general idea. So the value is roughly matched, and then the hue and chroma are fairly good as well. So it should be a bit easier to see, I think, with the next leaf, which is a bit lighter. Just need to adjust my camera. So because it's another green, I'm actually just going to maybe just give my brush a little bit of a white, but I'm not going to properly clean it. So this one, when I look at it, looks more yellow and lighter. So it's going to be a similar mixture to the previous one. I'm going to be using CAD yellow and then adding blue to that. This time, just to speed up the process, I've added a little bit of mineral spirits. So now that I've got my base in place, I feel like this color roughly matches probably the lighter portions of the leaf around the edge where some of the lights are reflecting back through. So if I want to get a bit more of an average, what I might do is just mix a little bit more mixture, the blue, pure blue and cadmium yellow, maybe a little bit of the burnt sienna into the center of it. Starts to pull the color closer to that original leaf. And generally it's not really too bad a match in real life at the moment. So again, if I kind of go back over what I've been using, the original leaf used a mixture of cadmium yellow, ultramarine blue, and burnt sienna, and sort of I'd say maybe a reasonable amount of ultramarine blue, probably half as much cadmium yellow, and then maybe a similar amount of burnt sienna as cadmium yellow. Whereas this leaf, I've actually used the same mixture. So I've used cadmium yellow, ultramarine blue, and burnt sienna, but I've used them in different quantities. So this one being lighter has used more of the cadmium yellow, slightly higher chroma maybe as well. So it's used more cadmium yellow and less burnt sienna relatively. So in my mind, if I was painting a scene that had a lot of leaves, or maybe a still life with flowers, or if I was painting a landscape that had greens, I'd try to bear in mind that for these darker greens that I'm painting, I'm using this particular kind of quantity of mixture, and I'm using a different sort of ratio of different paints in the lighter one. And that's useful as well. If I'm using the same pigments, I know that it's mostly going to use a kind of relative mixture of these three colors. So my palette could be simpler, or it also means that I can switch back from doing a lighter green to a darker green quite quickly. Sometimes if you're using completely different mixtures for different types of greens in a scene, and you're trying to paint the darks and paint the lights in, say, a tree or something like that, they can mix into each other and get muddy, and they don't work together. They clash and they create a different color entirely. And then your palette can get messy. If you know that you're using the same pigments but in different quantities, it doesn't really matter. You just sort of shift it darker by adding a bit more blue, or shift it lighter by adding a bit more cadmium yellow. Adjust its sort of brownness with the burnt sienna. And then things aren't going to get out of hand too quickly, which is definitely something that can happen when you're first starting to mix colors. I'm just going to pop my camera off. Can have a look at this next leaf. So you see I've gone for a kind of roughly an average of the leaf. Obviously there's sort of a darker portion here and a lighter portion around the edge. I'm not trying to paint the leaf exactly. I'm just trying to get a fairly kind of even average mixture of the leaf as a sort of starting point that I would then elaborate. So we're going to move on into the browns now. Quite sure why my camera keeps tilting weirdly when I swap it. So I'm actually going to give my brush a reasonable clean after this one, just because the brown mixtures are going to be fairly different from the greens. And I don't want to contaminate my browns too much with the green. So looking at this leaf, it's pretty close to the color of the palette. So what I'm going to do is just start by mixing a color that roughly matches this palette, then transfer it over to the canvas and see how it looks. Starting point is going to be a bit of burnt sienna. So looking at that, I know it's probably a little bit too dark, so I might lighten it a bit with white. So I've gone a bit too light there, maybe add a bit more burnt sienna back in. More, so I'm going to go for burnt umber. Now, this is an instance of a color that I've mixed on this palette is going to look when I actually place it on the canvas. So the palette is, say, a mid value. The canvas is obviously white. So as soon as I put a brush stroke of this onto the canvas, it's going to look a lot darker than the same color on my palette. So again, I might just use a little bit of mineral spirits to speed up the process. I'm going to quickly block this leaf. So I've got that roughed in. I can pretty quickly tell that the leaf is too light. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to darken it with a mixture of, I need a little bit more burnt sienna. I ended up using more of it than I was expecting. So I've got a bit of burnt sienna mixed with burnt umber. So I'm trying to use the burnt sienna just to keep the chroma up. So I'm going to mix that into what's already there. It's starting to get reasonably close. Value-wise, it feels pretty good. It possibly feels slightly too high chroma. So what I might do, I might just paint a little bit of burnt umber in it to try to bring the chroma down. See, yeah, that adjustment brings it fairly close to the leaf if I blow my eyes. Possibly still slightly too high chroma, although it's maybe due to the fact there are some sort of little blue reflected lights inside this leaf breaking up or disrupting the red. Yeah, not too far off. I think that one we can leave as it is and move on to the next, just to see how the mixture will differ. Got about 10 minutes or so left, so I'm trying to get through each of them. So yeah, looking at that on the screen, it does come across as slightly too red. It might do, just to try to expand the colors that we're using. I'm going to paint a little bit of, mix up a gray that's about the same value as that. And I'm going to mix that into it just to pull that red down a little bit because it is a bit too extreme, a lighter gray. I think that's doing a little bit better now. So looking at that, seems a bit better than it was. Not too far off. I'm going to finally move to, let's swing my camera around a bit to try and combat the glare. I've unfortunately ended up with a rare sunny day in the UK to do my my demonstration. Ooh, got loads of glare now. That's coming off my computer screen. So I'm going to swap down to this lighter leaf now, which is going to be a similar mixture actually to what I was just mixing up as the modifying color for the previous leaf. So I might actually just whack that straight on, see how it looks. There we go, color's getting a lot easier to see now that the light's changed quite a bit. So yeah, I'm going to make use of what I've already got there. This leaf's a little bit trickier actually because I've got kind of almost two versions of it because it's curving quite a lot at the top there. I might actually pin it back a bit just to make it easier to see. Let's pin that portion back. We're going to be matching this color in here roughly. So what I have definitely needs to go a bit grayer. Mix a good batch of grey into that. Probably also needs to go a bit lighter, so I'm just going to go straight in with white. And that's actually getting pretty close. Could maybe do with a touch of yellow. It's not quite as red as that first leaf. Yeah, that's starting to get there as a yeah, that's looking reasonably okay as a comparison. So finally, don't think I need to pop my camera off this time. Luckily the light seems to have disappeared, which is helpful to us. So the last color we're going to try to match is this flower, which is quite high chroma. And it'll be interesting to see if we can actually match it just with the yellow, with the CAD yellow. I'm thinking we probably will be able to, particularly if you're working quite thinly over white, you'll find it looks quite high chroma. The thinner you work over a lighter color, the more the color will glow. So working from the back edge of the CAD yellow so I don't get any green mixed in, or as little as possible. And add a touch of mineral spirits, and then I'm just going to almost basically glaze it over the surface of the canvas. pretty much actually matches it fairly well. Certainly as an average between the darker portion in the center of the flower to the outer edge. So yeah, I mean, if you were painting these flowers as a beginning point, you would now know all I need to do is get some of my mid-CAD yellow, put a little bit of mineral spirits, or mix a little bit of mineral spirits in with it, and then just basically glaze the surface of the white canvas. If you were working over a canvas that has a tone on it, or if you're working over the top of another paint color and you're trying to add the flowers in or add yellows in, you'll find that it looks significantly different. So even say this color kind of thinly glazed over this palette doesn't look quite as actually, I mean, probably relatively actually, given that the palette is sort of grayish, the yellow does stand out quite nicely against it. But you would find if you were to put side of this, say I was to do that now actually, say grey brown around the outside of the yellow. Actually, no, I won't bother doing that. I think that would be probably a topic for another lesson. But yeah, that pretty much covers what we were doing today. Hopefully everything looked okay, wasn't too low resolution or anything, and you could see how I was working. I'm going to be running these weekly throughout term times at OCAD, so there are links in the description of the video that you can check if you want to sign up to the course. The OCAD Studio, I think, is just a monthly fee, so you can sort of sign up for a month, sign out for a month if you need to, and you have access to tutorials with me, one-on-one tutorials via Skype. And you also will be able to watch these live lessons and access to more materials than you can't currently have on the YouTube channel. But I'm going to carry on doing these lessons on YouTube, so they're available free to anyone who wants to watch. And if you want to start taking part in the exercises and sort of producing your own, say this one, for example, if you wanted to do your own color matching, and then you had questions about it, or you wanted to send work through, if you sign up, you'll be able to do that. And I'll be able to work with you on all of these sorts of exercises. We cover a broad range of different disciplines, and I cover the drawing and painting. So as far as a kind of fundamental drawing and painting course, anyone looking to do something like that is covered. There's a lot of different projects, interesting things for you to work on. So yeah, definitely have a look at the website if you're interested. And thanks for watching. Hopefully see you guys soon.